welcome to Crime Clueless. I'm your host, Jenna.
I'm Lara.
I'm Krista.
And I'm Kayla.
We are so glad that you came back for the next part of Christine Franke's story, a bright, promising college student whose life was tragically cut short. We walked through the details of that fateful night and followed detectives as they began to unravel the mystery. We hope that you've already listened to part 1. If you have not, please go listen to that and then come join us for part 2. And keep an eye out for the rest of the story coming soon. Let's dive right in. Last time we talked about Christine's friends and family. Now let's move on and talk about her coworkers.
And could any of her coworkers think of anybody or think of, anybody else that had been frequenting the bar when she was working there?
They did interview a couple that I will tell you about, but they didn't mention the guy that Jen mentioned, which I find interesting.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
I was going to say that too.
Well, we all have basically the same brain, so
We're not the same.
That's interesting that if Christine would talk about it with Jen, but no one else from work had noticed, or she didn't mention that specific person to anybody else.
It could have been that he was maybe like her coworkers saw him with her, but she didn't complain about him to her coworkers, or maybe they did just think he was flirting, but she wasn't upset by it. I don't know. But that's something you would talk to your partner too.
Yeah, and that's interesting though, because you said, after the bar closed, they stayed for quite a while. It sounded like they were friends, like stay and chat while you're cleaning up. And I don't know, I talked to my coworkers about everything because you're together all the time. And especially if this had been happening for a while.
That's true. Yeah.
They did mention somebody that had been in cigars that night. So they were paying attention and they were talking. I'm not sure if they just didn't realize the connection, or again, if Christine just laughed it off and made it seem like no big deal because it's her workplace.
yeah, I mean, that would make sense too.
One of the guys that she had walked out with was her manager. Maybe she didn't share that with her boss. I'm not sure.
That makes sense.
So Detective Filippucci followed up with John, who was living in Massachusetts at the time. He came in to an interview in Orlando on November 19th. He was questioned about his relationship with Christine, how it ended, his alibi for the night she was murdered. He voluntarily gave a DNA sample and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. 2 of the detectives on her case went to Cigars the same night that Christine had been found to talk to her coworkers and her manager. Her manager's name was Todd. He expressed that he and Christine had been very good friends. He said in his interview that Christine was a blast to work with because she was so lively and animated. She made every shift so much fun. They had worked together at Christine's former job, which was at a place called Cookers. When he was hired as a manager at Cigars, he got her to come and work for him. He confirmed what the CCTV footage showed that the security guards at Universal City Walk had showed to detectives. They had all closed together the night before, along with 2 other staff members, Jason and Danny, ultimately leaving around 3:50 a.m. That was the last he saw or heard from her.
Can I ask you one more question, Jenna?
Of course.
When they were collecting DNA samples, did they collect any from people she was working with that night?
Yes, they collected him from everybody.
Okay. Because I was thinking maybe she asked like someone to follow her home if she was really tired to make sure that she got home. That was my thoughts.
I think that's what investigators thought too, because one of her coworkers, they drove the same way home. And then there was a part where they would get to where the road split and they each went separate ways. And he said he thought that night they had both driven and split because also they were trying to figure out if she went somewhere else to tie down the timeline better. He couldn't be 100% sure. And then when we get to trial, what happened was so far in the past that they had an even harder time especially with some of the questions that the defense came up with. While the defense had access to all of the case files from the beginning, the questions that he came up with to build his defense, a lot of times the witnesses couldn't answer or couldn't remember the exact specifics. That was one that he asked way in the future. And so her coworker said, I think so. I think we went home the same way and then split, but I can't be 100% sure.
So hard.
Well, you said like 18 years, right?
The trial didn't start for 22 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, I would not remember driving home that night.
I was trying to think back to, even 15 years.
Even last week.
I can't even remember exactly.
2 days ago.
I know.
I don't even know what I ate for breakfast this morning.
Right. And you would think something as horrifying and shocking would stay in your brain, but then you think about the details that you didn't necessarily correlate to that event.
Absolutely.
It would be so hard.
Totally. And things like that you're like, maybe you didn't pay attention even when you were driving.
I mean, something as habitual as that.
Yeah.
I mean, half the time when I'm supposed to be heading north, I head south to go to work. You just get in that autopilot, like,
Yeah.
this is the same route I drive every night. You're not going to remember.
And if you're normally driving that way together, maybe you don't even really notice just because that's how it always is.
Yeah.
And it's 3:51 in the morning.
Yeah.
Mhm.
You've been working and all those things.
Right. Her manager said that the next day, staff called to let him know that Christine hadn't shown up for her shift. He called around trying to find someone else to cover for her. He also tried to call Christine. He didn't know why she didn't show up until the police came that night.
When was her shift the next day? Was that like in the afternoon?
Yes, I think it was around the same time that she had started because she wasn't scheduled to work a double the next day. I get the feeling that it was earlier on. She wasn't working closing 2 nights in a row, especially Sunday night before she gets up and does school and her internship on Monday morning.
Okay.
Todd willingly gave a DNA sample on November 8th, and he was eliminated. Jason, who had also closed the night before with them, said he hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary the night Christine died. He described their walk from Cigars to the parking lot. He said he hadn't noticed anyone following them, and he didn't know if Christine had planned to go anywhere other than straight home. He assumed that was her plan because it was almost 4 a.m. She had worked a double shift. She was wiped out. He also gave a DNA sample and was eliminated as a suspect. Danny, who had also worked with them, didn't notice anything out of the ordinary that night, and he didn't give anything to investigators to further their case. He also gave a DNA sample and was eliminated as a suspect. There were others related to Cigars who Detective Filippucci wanted to talk to after eliminating the coworkers as suspects. He wanted to talk to after eliminating the coworkers who had been with Christine the night before she was killed. One was a man named Jeffrey, whose girlfriend worked with Christine at Cigars. He was loud about the fact that his girlfriend should be getting more shifts than Christine, and that Christine was working shifts that he thought his girlfriend should be getting. However, while he might have been mad about that, he voluntarily submitted a DNA sample and was ruled out as a suspect. Another was a man named Brett who worked nearby, so he frequented Cigars often. He was at the bar until close the night of October 20th. He was actually known to be there 4 to 5 times each week. The night in question, he was there with 2 friends, Elliot and Laura. They arrived around 12:30, and Brett said Christine was their server. He innocently flirted with her. He knew her because he was there so often. He said he had jokingly told her that he loved her, and her response was, "Thanks, I'm a lesbian." She sounds so cool. He and his friends left Cigars when it closed around 2 a.m. This was confirmed with the 2 friends that he had gone home with, Lara and Elliot. Elliot had driven all 3 of them home, and Lara had hung out with Brett until about 3:40 when he drove her home. He didn't have an alibi for the exact time in question, but it would take some work for him to be back in the employee parking lot at 3:50 to follow Christine home or to even know when she was going to be done closing because 3:50 was actually pretty late for them to still be there closing.
What time did the bar close? Did you say it closed at 2?
Yes.
So they were there for almost 2 hours after.
Wait,
Right.
did you say it closed at 2 or it stopped serving alcohol at 2?
They closed at 2.
Okay.
Yep. He did say that he didn't know where she lived. Theoretically, he could have gone there if he did know after dropping off Lara. He was willing to give a DNA sample and did so on November 29th. They also talked to Elliot, who confirmed that he had driven Brett and Lara home because they had been drinking. He said he was at cigars occasionally. He knew who Christine was. He gave a DNA sample on December 27th and was ruled out as a suspect as well. Police were also interested in anyone working around the apartment complex. There were 2 male maintenance workers that they wanted to question. One, a man named Orlando, was quick to offer a DNA sample and answer any of their questions. The other had been fired in the time between Christine's murder and when investigators tried to track him down. And it doesn't appear that they were ever able to get an interview or DNA sample from him. Investigators had a hard time finding more leads after they went through Christine's friends and family, her coworkers, her ex-boyfriend. They were running out of places to look or people to interview. They put out a bulletin on November 13th to other police departments in the state of Florida to see if there were any other cases similar to Christine's. They also hoped that maybe if a case in the future happened that was similar, those police departments would reach out, they could compare DNA, try to find a link. They were really creative, and honestly, it appears that they did a really good job following leads, always working this case, continually pulling out, reviewing, trying to come up with some other avenue to go down.
It seems like they followed up on a lot of leads.
They did, and they were able to get those DNA samples, which is better than a polygraph or any other way to determine if they were involved or not.
DNA sample from the crime scene. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and people knew that. So kind of makes me feel like if they're here, I'll give it to you. Like it wasn't me.
And I kind of think the fact that they said it was from a cigarette butt, they were probably hoping that someone would give them a DNA sample and then say, oh, well, I was there partying. Like if the DNA came back, do you know what I mean? If they actually had been the one to do it, they might have been more willing to give a DNA sample, thinking that was the only evidence.
Yeah, because that, if it was outside, they could be like, oh, yeah, but I
And
was.
they were, yeah,
Yeah.
in the common hallways or like outdoor hallway, right?
I'd be like, oh, yeah, I was there. I was visiting someone else,
Investigators learned on April 16th, 2002, that Florida Highway Patrol had arrested a man who was prowling around the apartment complex where Christine had lived. The man's name was Charles, and he was seen looking into the bedroom window of a 14-year-old girl. He told police he was looking for his dog. Spoiler, he didn't have a dog. Also, this wasn't the first time that he had been arrested for this same thing. He lived less than a mile away from the apartments. Investigators went through his trash and found things that they were able to test. They were also able to get a judge to agree to a tracking device for his car. On July 19th, they had Charles come in for a formal interview, and he did agree to give them a DNA sample. It was not a match for Christine's killer. The next month, in early May, they learned about a man named Matthew who had been arrested in Orlando at a Target store. While he was being arrested, he started making loud statements about Christine's murder. He said, quote, "That killer's loose, that one that shot that lady right around the corner, man." Also, quote, "I'll be laughing at you when he kills again. I'm gonna find that killer and make sure he kills again. I guarantee you he's gonna strike again." It also appears that Matthew implied he was the killer and said, quote, that he claimed credit for shooting that teacher, end quote.
He said that while he was being arrested?
Can you believe that?
Oh,
So it's really interesting coincidence. The officer that was arresting Matthew was Detective Gonzalez, who had been at the scene the day Christine was killed.
Oh, wow. What a coincidence.
The target they were at was really close to Christine's apartment, but it is crazy that one of the officers was the one arresting him and knew what those comments were in reference to and could relate it back to the detectives on this case.
That's wild.
Yeah. So they found out that Matthew was a resident of the Wellspring Institute, which was a licensed inpatient community treating its residents for behavioral problems. It was also really close to Christine's apartment complex. Matthew was being treated for behavior issues and drug use. Various counselors who worked with Matthew, as well as the director of the institute, spoke with detectives about Matthew. They commented that Matthew liked to mouth off, especially to push people's buttons. He had a history of making outlandish remarks. One counselor said Matthew was being treated for fetal alcohol syndrome and had the emotional capacity of a 6 or 7-year-old. They were told he was a loose cannon. He would hit walls and windows when he became upset. Multiple counselors commented on Matthew's dislike or hatred towards women and that he was verbally abusive to them. A former roommate of Matthew's from the institute told detectives, quote, he and Matthew liked to sneak out of the center after curfew, and oftentimes Matthew would do this on his own, end quote. So everything that the detective had learned about Matthew pointed to him being a possible suspect that he needed to look into right away. He found out he hated women, he was violent, and he had a history of everything that connected him to a case like Christine's. Add to that all that Matthew had said when he was being arrested at the Target. On May 9th, Detective Filippucci went to visit Matthew, who was now living with his father, Roger. I'm unclear if he wasn't allowed to continue living at Wellspring due to his arrest or what the reason was for his move. When the detective showed up, Roger, who was Matthew's dad, said that he was not allowed to talk to police. So he refused to sit for an interview and he refused to give a DNA sample. 4 days later, Roger reached out to the detectives and told them that he had retained a lawyer and all communication from then on out should go through this lawyer. The detectives reached out to the lawyer and requested a DNA sample. The lawyer said, yes, absolutely. We have no problem with an oral buccal swab, which is the name for the DNA samples they're collecting. We can definitely do that just for elimination purposes. The lawyer reiterated that it all had to go through him. The detectives thought that it sounded promising, but for whatever reason, they were not able to get a DNA swab. The lawyer kept changing the date, dragging their feet. 9 months passed, and they had not been able to get a sample. It was becoming very clear that they would have to get another way if they were going to get it.
Is that something that they can get? I mean, I don't know the answer to this. Is that something that they can get a warrant for? Or does it have to be voluntary?
So they can get a warrant for it if they can show to the judge that there's specific reason for why this person,
Probable cause.
right, or why this person is suspected and why they need the DNA sample. In this case, they didn't go through right here getting a warrant. I think because a judge wouldn't have granted it. There's nothing connecting him to Christine. Yes, he has the history. Yes, proximity. There's nothing that they can really put into a report to give to a judge.
It's not like someone saw him there or
Exactly.
he snuck out that night. There were reports that he had left. There weren't things like that.
Exactly. They had to find a different way to get their DNA sample. Before we talk about how they got the DNA sample from Matthew, during this 9-month period of time, while investigators were trying to get it from him through the lawyer, investigators continued interviewing and talking to people at the Wellspring Institute. They spent time talking to not only the counselors and the people that worked there, but also many of the residents that lived there. Many were certain they knew someone living there who was responsible. They knew a lot about each other and shared that with the Orlando PD. They talked about residents that were also currently in prison, but had been out when Christine was killed. Investigators were able to get DNA swabs from all who had pointed out Detectives were able to get DNA swabs from everybody who was at the institute or in prison but had been at the institute during Christine's murder. None of these people were a match.
How far was the institute from her apartment, did you say?
I think it's a mile away. It's really close.
Okay.
It's walking distance if he were to sneak out that night.
Okay.
That would be a coincidence if he did make it to her apartment. There's no real reason that he would go that direction,
Right.
but it is walking distance. So back to Matthew, they're still trying to get the DNA sample from him. Detectives had still not found a match for Christine's killer. Investigators had to get a little bit creative. Investigators collected paper cups from outside of his house that had been thrown away and were in the garbage. DNA was found on them, and it was not a match to Christine's killer. However, this did not rule Matthew out yet for detectives because he didn't live alone, and it was impossible to tell if the cups that they gathered were ones that he had drank out of, or if his father had, or anybody else that could have visited the house. This was in February of 2003, so they worked all of that time from May 2002 to February 2003 trying to get one with the lawyer. He was stalling. That's when they managed to find the cups, put them in to get a DNA profile from.
That's so long.
Yes. Then November 2004. So from the time that they had put the cups in till November 2004 had been almost 2 years. And right now we're 3 years after Christine had been killed. Detectives still had not found a match for Christine's killer. So they tried to revisit Matthew again. They asked him to come interview with them. He said, go through my attorney. He wouldn't come to the police station without his lawyer. He did tell the detective that he only said what he said when he was being arrested because he hadn't been taking his medication. On December 1st, 2004, a detective followed Matthew to a nightclub called Roxy's. He watched Matthew drink from a plastic cup and leave it in the trash. The detective gathered the cup. He got it tested for DNA right away. It came back not a match. Investigators weren't satisfied yet because everything they had learned about Matthew and his refusal to be interviewed or give a DNA swab still kept him on their radar. Detectives knew that Matthew had to come into the courthouse to pay a fine for a traffic accident he had been in a couple months prior. They alerted the clerk, her name was Sabrina, who would be processing the payment to keep an eye out for him. When he came in on December 3rd, 2004, Sabrina was ready. She offered him a piece of gum. He accepted. He took out the gum that he had been chewing, wrapped it in the piece of paper. She offered to throw it away for him. He accepted and handed it over.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So she crushed that assignment.
Amazing how things have changed. That would not
Yes.
happen anymore this day and age.
I mean,
100% sure this all sounds by the book,
but this was 20 years ago,
Ah,
almost to the day.
wow, what a coincidence.
Yeah. However, they were ultimately not able to get a DNA profile off of the gum because of some of the chemicals that were present in the gum. Beyond frustrated with the suspect, who had still not fully been crossed off the list, Detective Filippucci decided to get a search warrant for a DNA swab for Matthew. It was denied because the judge said the link between Matthew and Christine had not been established. This seems a little confusing to me because if we're assuming that her killer was someone she didn't know, it seems really tough to establish a link beyond proximity, which they do have, and other circumstantial evidence. But you do need more than that to get a warrant.
Yeah, which, I mean, that makes sense, but if they're going with the theory that it's not someone she knows, then obviously right now he seems the most logical candidate.
Right. Out of everyone that they've interviewed and DNA tested, they're all ruled out. We don't have any open leads right now. So I agree. He's the only candidate right now. After 2.5 years and all the effort that was put into investigating Matthew, they decided They had to table the search into him for the time being. During this time, they were still busy trying to find other leads. In 2003, they put up a large billboard featuring Christine and offering a $5,000 reward in hopes of someone speaking up and helping them to find her killer. Detectives canvassed her prior neighborhood and her current neighborhood, talking to people, trying to find anyone who knew something, anyone who had seen something, or could offer any kind of tip or lead. In 2004, Detective Emmett Browning was assigned to assist on this case. The following year, Detective Filippucci was assigned to a new division within the Orlando PD, and Detective Browning took over Christine's case.
Anna, is this the first time that they had offered up any reward in her case, or there wasn't anything closer
It
to
seems like it.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if it's because they were able to find leads and they did have the DNA profile. They had it in CODIS. They also had, the shell casing and the bullet in.
Yeah. So they just didn't maybe think that they needed to offer a reward until.
Yeah, it seems like it. And it was about 2 years after her murder, but it does seem like a long time. Detective Browning picked up the case with a fresh set of eyes and went to work interviewing her friends and family again, her coworkers, neighbors, and other people of interest that had previously been tracked down so he could talk to them himself and determine if there were other questions he could ask, or maybe he could spark a new memory, something that had been newly remembered or missed the first time. He also collected DNA from anyone who hadn't given a sample previously. He tracked down Matthew again, since he had been one that never gave a DNA sample or had been cleared. Matthew was still unwilling to provide a DNA sample or doing an interview. So again, they followed him to a bar. He left a glass on the counter and they sent it in for testing. They found both male and female DNA. Again, neither were a match for the DNA in this case. After so many attempts, they decided to cross him off the list as a suspect. In November 2005, Detective Schneider was assigned to help Detective Browning with Christine's case. And again, a lot of times when I hear about these cases, they investigate them for 6 months or a year, maybe 2 years, and then it goes in the cold case. I am impressed with this one, how much follow-up they had for year after year.
Yeah, because it sounds like we're at year 4.
Right.
And they're still working on it, which is impressive.
I agree. Persistent. I like that word. So now we had another detective reviewing her case with another fresh set of eyes. He found more avenues to go down, more theories to follow up. A few months prior, Detective Browning sent the suspect DNA from Christine's case to DNA Print Genomics Incorporated. This company was founded in 1983 and by the early 2000s was one of the first to create detailed profiles of the person in question. They were able to determine their heritage and what their physical features were. The physical features aspect was still a little controversial at the time, but again, they didn't have leads. They needed something. So Detective Browning received the report back in August of 2005. The report stated the suspect's sample was estimated to be 73% African ancestry and 27% European ancestry. This told them they were specifically looking for a Black male. The case was unfortunately dealt a blow in December 2005 when they learned the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, or FDLE, had a contamination in their testing labs, and dozens of tested samples from 19 cases had used tainted vials.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The FDLE said they reran all affected samples and they had reliable results, but it was a disaster that affected many cases for years to come. Defense attorneys continually tried, if their case was affected, to use that to throw out DNA evidence.
Yeah. Wow.
Her case was one of these.
Yes.
Of course.
Of course. The silver lining here is that when the defense attorney tried to use this as a reason to throw out the case years down the road in Christine's trial, it was quickly dismissed because all the samples tested in that time period had been exclusions and not a match for the actual suspect.
What does that mean?
It means the samples that they had tested during this time period using those tainted vials were only samples that proved people were not involved in Christine's murder. If it had been somebody whose sample was tested and it was a match, the defense attorney would have had a much better case for throwing out the DNA evidence. And again, in this case, that's all we have.
Okay.
And the samples collected from her were not in the tainted vials.
Right.
Oh, okay.
So it was only the suspect's DNA that was tested in the tainted vials.
Okay. That makes
Yes.
sense.
So it was only people that they had tested to exclude from being her killer and not anybody who was a match and not Christine herself.
And not the DNA collected from the crime scene.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes more sense. I thought you were talking about the DNA they found was tainted.
Thank goodness that wasn't the case, because then we never would have been able to take this case to trial. In 2006, Detective Browning retired. Detective Schneider took over the case. He decided to focus on City Walk, where Cigars was, and on the other restaurants and employees that were there. He also knew they were looking for a black male. While reviewing the old case files, he picked up on the man Christine had talked to Jen about, who wouldn't stop flirting with her and was giving her a bad feeling. Jen had told investigators Christine called him a, quote, weird guy. She barely mentioned any details, only the very basic physical details that we talked about, but she had mentioned that he was African American and that he worked at City Walk. Maybe she thought NASCAR Cafe, but she wasn't entirely sure. It turns out that Jen had mentioned him again when she was interviewed by Detective Browning when he got the case. It was a little odd that this had been missed twice with everything the detectives did investigate.
Wait, I thought you said they had already questioned him. They never did?
No.
Oh,
no.
okay.
No one knew who he was. Yeah, they didn't know his name, anything. And she hadn't mentioned him to the coworkers, so no one could recognize him.
Right. Also, detectives missed it. It was one that she gave on the day that Christine was found. And then, like I said, she followed it up again when Detective Browning took over the case. But both times, they hadn't investigated it.
Oh.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. But now, in this case, we know that they're looking for somebody with African American heritage. And he's seeing this lead that hasn't been followed up on. He wanted to work this avenue as it had never been looked into. His report around that time says, quote, I determined the lead of the black male from NASCAR who was harassing the victim went unworked due to the significant lead into Matthew and the residential treatment facilities and all of the patients that were there, end quote. Back in 2001, fortunately, one of the detectives had obtained all of the NASCAR Cafe employees employed while Christine worked at Cigars. He was able to narrow down his list based on what he had from the DNA profile as well as the description from Jen. By this point, he was also able to eliminate employees because they had records that he was able to check their DNA in the CODIS database. In the end, he was left with two men. One was named Anthony and one was named Jay. Anthony had a criminal history with an arrest for robbery. He would have been 20 at the time Christine was killed. Jay would have been 37. He more resembled the description Jen had given in her interviews, including his age, weight, skin tone, and the hair that he had at the time. Because of the criminal past for Anthony, though, they decided to start there. He was followed for several days by members of the Orlando PD fugitive unit. Finally, while following him, he dropped a sandwich on the ground. Luckily, it had DNA on it they could use, and they were able to eliminate him as a suspect. So they moved on to Jay. They ran his background and his record and discovered that he had been arrested by Orlando PD in 1990. And when he was arrested, he was in possession of a Raven 25 caliber semi-automatic handgun, which was a possible match to the gun that was used to kill Christine.
Oh, wow.
Detective Schneider wrote, based on my training and experience, it is known offenders who tend to favor a particular make and model of a weapon. Jay also had a noticeable spike in criminal conduct, resulting in law enforcement contact around the time of Christine's murder for smaller charges, but things like drug offenses and weapon charges. He was a convicted felon, but his DNA was not in CODIS because he never was convicted on an offense that would have compelled him to provide a DNA standard. End quote. The detective was also able to learn that Jay did in fact go to Cigars sometimes, according to his coworkers. Jay was called a, quote, ladies' man, and He actually was fired from NASCAR Cafe after a disagreement with his manager. Detectives tried to find what kind of car Jay drove at the time and if he had a connection to any kind of white sedan that was seen on surveillance the morning Christine was killed. He was unable to determine this, but after further digging, he did find that Jay's common-law wife, Jessica, gave him a link. Her father owned a vehicle that fit the description. This was what the detectives needed. They wrote a warrant, including all of the information from Jen, the DNA profile, the coworkers, his job, his access to the car that was on the surveillance footage, and the warrant requested a DNA sample from Jay to compare to that in evidence. On April 7th, 2011, the warrant was granted. Within 2 hours, detectives went to Jay's house. The Orlando PD had been staked out at his residence for some time and had seen both Jay and his wife there. When the team arrived with the warrant, however, the home was empty. They learned that the couple had moved out just a couple days prior. Neighbors mentioned...
Of course.
Yes. And they learned this from neighbors. Those neighbors mentioned that Jay kind of creeped them out. One specifically said that she was glad he moved because he would sit and stare at her daughters, and she did not like that at all.
Yeah.
Detectives tracked down the new home of the couple, and Jessica told them that Jay was driving a long-haul semi and was out of town. Investigators couldn't find any evidence of this, which they found odd. They couldn't find that he had that kind of job or that he had that kind of driver's license, nothing. They were able to get a warrant for a trace on his phone and found that he was in Michigan. When he returned to the area in early June, he was pulled over on a traffic stop. And detained until a detective on the case, Detective Haas, could arrive to execute the warrant. He was asked if he knew the victim and denied knowing her. He declined to answer any other questions and declined a DNA swab. So they used the warrant and they got the swab anyways. He was released after this. The swab was sent in. Again, they analyzed the DNA profile. In the end, it didn't match the DNA from the crime scene, and he was excluded from the suspect list.
This is so frustrating.
It is, and it's so, we're 10 years in.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Detectives did indicate that Jay was the man Jen had reported stalking Christine. So now they at least knew that the person who killed Christine was not the same person as the one that Jen had mentioned in her interviews with detectives. Even though it was a lot of time and effort spent on Jay, it was helpful to identify who that was and to cross that lead off the list.
I'm sure that was helpful to Jen too. She'd probably been thinking about that for years, especially if they never followed that, tip from her. It was never investigated.
That's such a good point.
Yeah, I didn't even think about that, but yeah.
She'd probably been thinking about it for the past 10 years. Why didn't they look into what I told them?
Yep, the one person that she could say was possible.
And even though she doesn't have closure yet.
It's always helpful to mark people off the list.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Especially somebody that's come up since day one. Detective Snyder retired in 2012, and we have our last final detective on the case. Unfortunately, though, this is when Christine's case stalled for a few years. After following every possible lead they could, they had nothing else. Unfortunately, this is all too common in cases, and I just can't imagine being the family involved in a cold case that drags on for years, but also decades. So that's where we're going to end this part of the episode. When we come back, we'll jump ahead in time and we'll find out how Detective Fields was able to use DNA evidence to actually track down and bring justice to Christine Franke.
I'm so invested in this now. I need to know how it ends.
Yes.
I can't wait.
And I love the next part. It's so interesting how they were able to solve this puzzle, especially after so many years.
Yeah.
Well, don't forget, refuse to be clueless, careless, or caught off guard.
Not today, murderers.
Thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. We'll see you next time.